Good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU, welcome to the January installment of the Alumni Lunch and Learn series. Today's session is Elections 2022 and Beyond with our speakers, Dr. Bob Holsworth and Dr. Robin McDougall. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Wilder School hosts free virtual events like this one monthly. Each session features change agents, thought leaders, and policymakers who provide insights and commentary on the relevant topics of the day. My name is Stephen Dozier, and I'm the Director of Development and Alumni Engagement here at the Wilder School. Before we get started, I'd like to share a couple of updates. First, we are excited to announce that we're continuing to rise in the rankings. The Wilder School is the number one graduate program for public affairs in Virginia and among the top 15% nationally. We are ranked 35th among public affairs graduate schools and 29th in public management and leadership. We are proud that we're at the forefront of our field. Our most recent edition of the Wilder School in Action magazine is available online. So check it out by clicking the live link on this slide on your screen, or check out all of our links and to all of our updates in the chat box. And now to present our moderator and share more exciting news is Dean and Professor Dr. Susan Gooden.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and welcome everyone. Delighted that you're joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, which will be exceptional. Bob Holsworth, who will be introduced more formally momentarily, has been a great friend of the Wilder School and is certainly a commentator that is revered and is very thought-provoking. So I know we will all learn a lot from his insights. I just wanted to share a few items about the Wilder School before I turn it over to Robin. First, please join me in wishing our namesake, Governor Wilder, a happy 92nd birthday. He turned 92 years old yesterday, and the photo you see is from a celebration held this weekend. And so we hope that the governor continues to enjoy long life and continues to be as actively involved in Virginia politics and in the nation. I also want to bring to your attention, we're going to be talking a lot today about the General Assembly and public policy at the federal level. We just don't talk about it at the Wilder School. We are about it, including with our students. So our Virginia Capital Semester Internship Program is up and running again this year, where we have a number of undergraduate students who are down at the General Assembly, getting a better understanding of the legislative process, seeing the sausage being made. This is an invaluable opportunity and experience for our students, this internship program. So we congratulate all of the interns who are there and being part of the legislative process. I also wanted to share with you that for those of you who are thinking about coming back to graduate school or know others who might be interested in picking up a master's degree, before you have all of our graduate programs in criminal justice, homeland security and emergency preparedness, public administration, urban and regional planning, and our Ph.D. program. Our Homeland Security program and our public administration program are both able to be completed fully online. And just a note that most of these programs have a February 1st early decision deadline where the application fee is waived. And with the cost of groceries going up every day, you can certainly probably put those savings to good use. And then I also wanted to share finally, just an invitation to please save the date. Our signature Excellence in Virginia Government Awards, EVGA, will be held on Tuesday, April the 11th at the Richmond Marriott. And we anticipate later this month announcing the full array of award winners and nominees. And this will be a most exemplary group. So we invite you to join us and to please save the date. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's session, who is our Associate Dean of Research and Outreach, Robin McDougall. And Robin leads our Centers and Institutes at the Wilder School, and she is also a leader of our Commonwealth poll, which is a signature poll that has received awards and recognition from CNN. And so this is a poll of Virginians and Virginian attitudes, which provides great information on sort of the attitudes and the opinions of those right here in the Commonwealth. So I will turn it over to Robin, who will moderate today's session. Robin?
Thank you so much, Dean Gooden. And thank you for pointing out the Commonwealth poll. Our most recent poll looking at our state and national issues were just released. Our state issues was released just last week. And as of today, our national issues poll release just hit the press. And you will notice that both Governor Youngkin and President Biden's approval rating are right there at about 50 to 52% of Virginians in the Commonwealth viewing their behaviors within the White House and within the executive mansion of Virginia as positive. Most Virginians seeing the economy and education as their top concerns of what they would like the members of the General Assembly to focus on during this legislative session. And so as a perfect backdrop to announce today's speaker, Dr. Bob Holsworth, it's my honor and privilege to present to you Dr. Holsworth, who is one of the leading political analysts in Virginia. He is a regular political analyst for CBS 6 in Richmond, and his comments on Virginia and national politics have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, as well as most newspapers throughout the nation. He's appeared on almost every American television channel, and as well as the BBC and Fuji Television. He was named one of the 100 influentials in Virginia politics by Campaign and Elections magazine. Dr. Holsworth was the founding director of both the Center for Public Policy and the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs right here at VCU. He received VCU's Outstanding Teacher Award and the State Council of Higher Education of Virginia's Outstanding Faculty Award. Dr. Holsworth is currently the managing principal in Decide Smart, a firm that provides analysis and planning assistance to agencies, local governments, nonprofits, and the private sector companies with governmental interest. He has served on numerous boards and commissions, including Governor McDonald's Independent Bipartisan Advisory Commission on Redistricting. He served as the executive director of Governor Warner's Commission on Efficiency and Effectiveness in Virginia state government, and completed 2 terms on the Board of Visitors for Virginia Commonwealth University, as well as was the chair of the Great Aspirations Scholarship Program. Currently, Dr. Holsworth serves on the board for RVA 757 Connects. Dr. Holsworth received his Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And just one more reminder, as Dr. Holsworth gives his presentation today, please feel free to submit your questions throughout the chat for us to present to Dr. Holsworth at the end of his presentation. And without further ado, Dr. Bob Holsworth talking about elections 2022 and beyond. Dr. Holsworth?
Dr. McDougall and Dean Gooden and everybody who's watching. Thanks very much. It's great to be with everybody today. It is a very exciting time in politics. And so what I'd like to do today is to give a little bit of a kaleidoscope. And that kaleidoscope will focus first on what happened in 2022, what happened in November. But then I want to move on to what's going on now in Virginia. I want to talk a little bit about the governor, both with his session and his potential national aspirations, talk about the session, and then also talk about the upcoming election in 2023. I'm going to go over this pretty quickly so that we can take questions and comments and have a conversation. So let me just begin by speaking about what happened in November. Going into November, by and large, there was a general sense that the Republicans should do pretty well in these congressional elections. And there were 3 reasons for that. The first was simply the historical reason, the historical sense that traditionally when a president has his first midterm after being elected, the opposing party takes an average of 28 seats in the House and 4 seats in the Senate. Secondly, what you also had was that you had President Biden with an approval rating nationally that was hovering in the low 40s. sometimes high 30s, sometimes getting up to 43, 44%. But by and large, there was a sense that the president was not very popular nationally. And this was compounded by the third factor, which was beyond the popularity rating and the historical nature of what happens, that by and large, we had inflation at a 40-year high. We had many young people who probably had never seen inflation at this level at all. So the trifecta of history, economic conditions, and a low approval rating led many Republicans to believe that it was going to be a minimum of a red wave. And if you were watching conservative television in the weeks before the election, there was almost a contest to come up with a new superlative about what was going to happen. Was it going to be a hurricane, a tsunami? But there was a sense that the Republicans were likely to take the Senate and develop a large majority in the House as a result. As we know, that didn't happen. And part of the reason, I think, is a little bit related to how the Democrats viewed this race and what they tried to do as well. So the Republicans essentially wanted to make the race a referendum on President Biden. And the Democrats decided that ultimately their strategy was to make the election into a choice between the Democrats and what they believed on some key issues and what they thought was a Republican Party that had become too extreme, a MAGA Republican Party, as they put it. And the Democrats certainly benefited from the Dobbs decision in the early summer, when the Supreme Court eliminated Roe v. Wade, really for the first time in memory, took away a right that people had had on abortion. And there was an early indicator that this could be very problematic for the Republicans, because there was a referendum in Kansas in which there was a ballot referendum to ban abortion. A lot of people thought it would pass, at least it would be very close. And by a 60-40 margin, it was rejected by voters in Kansas. And that clearly still had an impact coming in November. And then secondly, you had the reemergence of Donald Trump onto center stage in American politics, and in particular, in his activities in the Republican nominating process and selection process in the battleground states, where Arizona, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Georgia had sort of Trump-endorsed candidates running for Senate who were ultimately seen, I think, as out of the mainstream to a large degree, and they did not succeed. That, in fact, if you looked at those four battleground states, Republican performance in House elections clearly did very much better than it did in these elections for Senate. So what you had was suburban independents, especially women, sort of reject the Republican Party and move in this election to the Democrats. One other way of looking at that is that if you looked at the Biden approval rating, those people who strongly disapproved of Biden stayed with the Republicans, but there was a group of people who had, who somewhat disapproved, as they call it in the polls, of Biden. And those folks ultimately, many of them, not all of them, but enough of them supported the Democratic candidate, even if they weren't fully supportive of the president there. So that's what happened. At the end of the day, the Democrats come up with a majority that's increased in the Senate by one. They lose the House. It's a split decision, but the Republicans don't have anywhere near the majority they had hoped for in the House. And that has made things more complicated, as you saw 2 weeks ago with the selection of the speaker. By and large, it's hard to imagine that much is going to get done in Congress right now, that I think there's going to be a lot of positioning for the 2024 election. And we just don't know how some of these battles, such as that over the debt ceiling, are actually going to be resolved. That if Washington politics was pretty toxic beforehand, it's unlikely to see any improvement whatsoever given the election results right then. So now turning to Virginia, what happened in 2022 in the election in Virginia is that we saw we did not have a statewide Senate race. Tim Kaine's up for election in 2024, Mark Warner in 2026. We had 11 House races. We had a 7-4 Democratic majority in the House. That turned out to be a 6-5 Democratic majority, as Elaine Luria was defeated by Jen Kiggins, but Abigail Spanberger and Jennifer Wexton held on to their seats relatively easily, despite some well-funded challengers. The Kiggins-Luria seat was essentially done by, you might say, by the court-ordered redistricting that occurred. That in that redistricting, Luria's seat went from one that tilted slightly Democratic to one that Glenn Youngkin had carried by 10 points for governor. So Luria actually ran stronger than McAuliffe did in that district, but still lost by 4 points. So at the end of the day, it's a 6-5 majority. Now we come to 2023, and we have Governor Youngkin, and it's an interesting position, but Governor Youngkin, at least in my mind, seems to be juggling two things. One is being the governor of Virginia, and the second is dipping his toes in the national water and thinking about whether or not he's going to run for president. And that is sort of an interesting element here, because when Youngkin carried Virginia, he immediately sort of catapulted onto the national Republican stage because he won in a state that had been trending blue. He'd come up with this sort of unique education argument on parental rights, on parents' rights. And he was seen as a person who was very appealing on television and had the capacity to take a message nationally. At the same time, he's an absolute newcomer, hadn't been in government before, had a lot to learn, and has to govern the state in a state where governors only serve one term before they have to retire from office for at least a little while, because Virginia is the only state in the country where governors can't run in consecutive terms. So as we see Governor Youngkin doing this, it's kind of interesting about what will occur. Now, the other point I want to mention is that in Virginia right now, where we have a Republican governor, a Republican House, a narrow majority, 52-48, and the Democrats have a narrow majority in the Senate, we have divided government. And for the past 20 years, with the exception of 2 years in the McDonald administration and the last 2 years of the Northern administration, that's what we've had. We've had divided government in that entire time. And what that means for the assembly session is that the big items that get done are by and large items in which the two parties can agree on that. And basically, when they don't agree, they argue and they set up for the next election. But by and large, we've been in this situation for a long time. And this is not that uncommon. So as I look at this session right now, the basic point of agreement, which I think is on an important issue, which is vital for Virginia, is likely to be, I think, on mental health, because we've been trying to make some progress on this for a number of years. The Democrats have been advocating it, and now Governor Youngkin has put significant money in the budget to try to ensure that people who are at least in a mental health crisis can have a bed, that we don't have to be turning people away or sending people from Southwest Virginia to Chesapeake to get a bed. And that's the place where I think the parties can reach some agreement. Typically as well, the parties have also agreed in Virginia on economic development issues. But even here, there's a little bit of a issue that they normally agree on dollars to help support economic development, dollars for workforce development. And there's probably going to be a range of agreement on that. But we now have this issue that just emerged in the last couple of days when Governor Youngkin turned down a Ford plant that in Virginia with at least one of two finalists, and in a lot of people's mind, probably the finalist for a plant in Pittsylvania County that would have put billions of dollars of investment in and supported 2,500 jobs on the grounds that Ford is too connected. This plant is too connected with a Chinese group that makes batteries that's going to be under a licensing agreement, and that is connected to what Governor Youngkin has called the Chinese Communist Party. This is really sort of outside the norm for Virginia. We have pretty significant relationships with China. China owns Smithfield Foods, the pork manufacturing company, and we've never quite seen this. And there are a lot of people suggesting that maybe this is because the governor's national ambitions and his concern that Ron DeSantis has been bashing China so successfully inside the Republican circles that maybe this is factoring into it. But this is likely to become an even more prominent issue in the next few days as both sides talk about that. But by and large, when I see this session, I think that's probably the mental health is going to be the biggest area of agreement. I do think they'll agree on a lot of economic development matters, with the exception of the Pennsylvania plant. But at the same time, there's going to be tremendous disagreement on efforts to change voting requirements or photo ID requirements. There's going to be disagreement on certain kinds of educational policies, particularly those that impact transgender kids in terms of how the culture war comes to education. And there's going to be positioning for the 2023 elections. So let me briefly turn to the upcoming elections before I take your questions. 2023, every member of the Assembly in the House and in the Senate are up for election. And we have that every 4 years when the Senate terms come up. What's interesting and very uncertain about this term, however, is that the redistricting that occurred now has been a very dramatic redistricting. The citizens agreed to this redistricting commission that didn't particularly work, but at the sort of the backstop for that was they were going to turn redistricting over to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court hired a couple of experts to come in and redraw the lines. And what happened, at least in my mind, is the lines that were redrawn are far less gerrymandered than the traditional lines, that by and large, the lines make more sort of technical sense than ever before. But the Supreme Court made a decision that I thought was unusual, that they had two choices, that they could have engaged in what I call a minimalist redistricting, in which they would have taken the existing districts and by and large just modified them in order to respond to the demographic changes in Virginia. Or they could do what they did. And what they did was they said they were going to redraw lines. They're going to tell these special masters to redraw the lines without paying any attention to where any incumbent resided. And what that meant is that 40% of the House and the Senate, essentially, maybe a little more in one of the bodies, were actually tossed in with one another. So we now have Democratic incumbents tossed in the same district with Republican incumbents. We have Republican incumbents tossed in the same district with Republican incumbents, and Democratic incumbents tossed in with Democratic incumbents. So essentially, redistricting became almost a backdoor term limits. There's going to be quite a change in the General Assembly. Regardless of what happens in partisanship, there's going to be a real change in the nature of the composition, just in terms of who's in there and who's not. Now, in terms of the general election, my sense is that both parties really are going to be actively involved in this. The Republicans and Governor Youngkin understand that this is a great opportunity for them, that if Governor Youngkin could actually hold the House and flip the Senate and have a result of flipping the entire state red, that would make his legislative agenda much easier to obtain support for the last 2 years, and certainly give a strong new feather in his cap if he has these national aspirations. At the same time, for the Democrats, they really think they have a chance to flip, to keep the Senate and flip the House. From the Democratic perspective, they think 2021, where Youngkin won, was a little bit aberration because it was really driven by the pandemic and how frosted so many parents were about 18 months of remote education for their kids. And they look at the results in the 2022 elections, and they say if you superimposed the new legislative districts upon that, the Democrats would have a chance to retake the majority. Democrats are obviously going to push the abortion issue. Republicans are going to continue to talk about parents' rights, the education issues they think that have helped them. They're going to talk about Governor Youngkin's lower taxes. They're going to say the Democrats are too soft on crime. And you're going to see those kind of arguments made. My sense is that at the end of the day, the partisan composition of both the House and the Senate are going to be determined by a relatively small set of elections. Most of those elections are going to be either in Richmond metropolitan area or Hampton Roads. That Northern Virginia remains a place where the Democrats are going to run very, very strong. The rural areas of the state in Southern and Southwest Virginia are going to be places, and through the Valley are going to be places where Republicans are going to run very, very strong. And the big competition in the legislature is going to be in the Richmond area and the Hampton Roads area. And I would just mention one race in the Senate that's going to have a tremendous impact, which is Siobhan Dunavant in our area, who represents Henrico, versus Schuyler Van Valkenburg, who's a delegate who's running for that seat. It's a very competitive seat, had been leaning Republican after the redistricting and now leans a little bit Democratic. And if the Democrats are going to retake the Senate, they're going to need to win that seat against what has been historically a strong Republican candidate. So that's where we are in Virginia. And then very, very quickly, we then come to 2024. The question is, Donald Trump is saying he's running. Has Ron DeSantis readily overcome him? And for Glenn Youngkin, what will be the lane that he would run in if he decides to run? You have the MAGA lane, you might say, where you have DeSantis and Trump. It's hard to imagine somebody getting much oxygen in that lane with those two in there. You have the alternative lane where you have people like Larry Hogan or Sununu from New Hampshire, more traditional Chamber of Commerce Republican lane, and then Youngkin trying to find some lane in the middle. Whether that exists and whether he's the person or somebody like Nikki Haley would be the person is certainly an open question. The Democrats, President Biden thinks he's going to run. I don't think he's a strong candidate personally, but that others might have different opinions. I think he would beat Donald Trump if Trump was the nominee. I'm not sure how he would fare with anybody else. But at the same time, the Democrats have a real challenge in thinking about how they would contest him. One could imagine a couple of people doing so, like Newsom or Pritzker. But until Biden makes a decision, I think everybody in Washington is kind of frozen. But in any case, it'll be a great year and it'll keep pundits like me working. So Robin, if we have any questions, I'd love to take them.
Yes, sir, we do. And thank you so much. And you're right. It's going to be an interesting time in Virginia and across the country. So, you spoke a little bit about the potential Senate districts with Senator Donovan and Delegate Van Valkenburg. There's a question about what is your sense on the future prospects of the Virginia Senate district that Aaron Rouse recently flipped. So for our audience, that was originally Jen Kiggin's seat that she was a Republican and just moved to Congress. And it was taken over by the Democrats, giving the Democrats an additional seat of majority in the Senate of Virginia. So do you project, Dr. Holsworth, that to kind of stay a Democrat seat potentially go back to being a Republican seat with this new kind of district map, or is it going to continually be this toss-up? As if I recall correctly, at that time, the senator, soon to be Congresswoman, only won by 1% to turn it as a Republican seat. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's going to be one of the 3 or 4 seats that's there. I mean, Rouse won an election in which he emphasized abortion. He won it by less than 400 votes.
Right.
So I don't know whether it'll be a rematch with Kevin Adams again, or whether there'll be another candidate. But my sense is that if you look at, as I said, those, where there are competitive seats, the Virginia Beach area, they have Linwood Lewis against Bill DeSteff is another possible race that's going to be very competitive down there. So my sense is that those are the places that people are going to be pouring the money and looking at that. And if you're the Republicans, you look at a seat that you lost by less than 400 votes, you're going to say, let's have a rematch and let's see what we can do next time around.
Great, thank you so much. So another question is, you've talked about Governor Youngkin's views on the national stage, and you laid out a really great approach that he could have during the 2023 statewide elections. Do you see him announcing anytime soon, as former President Trump did, or do you see him more following the path of Governor DeSantis and just kind of keeping his foot in the water, but continuing to have people question? What do you think would be to most of his advantage?
Yeah. Well, I think he's going to wait until he feels that he has to get in, if he's there. Now, I do think he's going to get in. Now, I could be wrong about that. And so it's an interesting feature there. If you look at the Republican polls right now, he doesn't scratch the surface. He doesn't get to 1%. He's behind Pompeo, Haley, anybody else that's ever mentioned. He's, who's in the low single digits. He's not even there. However, there are 2 groups inside Republican circles who really like him. One is the consultant class, because they think that he can be sort of what I would call MAGA light, that he can embrace a lot of those views, but he does it in a warmer, more inviting way, that he's going to be better on television than DeSantis, and then he has that opportunity. And the other group inside the Republican Party that likes him a lot is what I call the donor class, the business people that he has done business with, and who think, again, very much like the consultants do, that he's kind of one of us. He understands business. He's not way off on the left. He's not going to turn people off the way Trump has and the like. So the governor hasn't said anything about that yet, about whether he's going to run or not. He was asked by the Christian Broadcasting Network the other day why he ran for governor. And he said he was praying and God told him he should leave the Carlyle Company and run for governor. He hasn't yet said whether he's gotten a message for the presidency at the moment. But at the same time, he's done nothing to say he's not running. He says he's humbled by the attention. It's a nice thing to be known by. He's certainly going to be considered as a vice presidential candidate if he runs or not. I think if he runs for president, he's going to harm himself in Virginia even more, because I think Virginians elect a governor to be governor for 4 years, and they don't expect him a year into the governorship to run for president. So that's another reason why I think he's going to delay.
Great. Thank you so much. So we have some questions that go to the national stage. So first, in Virginia, do you think Senator Kaine will retire, or will he run for re-election?
That's a good question, because I don't know. There's been rumors about that for sure. I think Senator Kaine seems to enjoy being a senator. That there's sometimes where governors become senators and they don't like it at all. George Allen really didn't like the Senate. He liked being the governor. He liked running things, liked being the executive, just thought the Senate was, slow, boring, didn't work. Tim Kaine seems to like the work in the Senate. He's a really smart guy. And now the Democrats, have a majority. He can be even a little more effective, probably. He seems to be eager also to work across the aisle when possible to find Republican support. At the same time, maybe there are just some personal choices that would make him leave, and that would leave an opening on the Democratic side for that. And you would think that the people who would likely run on the Democratic side, because the bench isn't that strong right now, would be people who come out of the House on that front. And, by and large right now, you're talking about, I think Jennifer Wexton, Abigail Spanberger, and Jennifer McClellan would be likely the cases. I should also mention there's a sense that Spanberger may well run for governor in 2025. She's won 2 elections in 2 different congressional districts now. She's a moderate Democrat, would be in many ways, a lot of people think, an ideal candidate for the governor. But she'll have contests in the Democratic primary. And her challenge is that she has never had essentially a large African-American constituency, which is very important in choosing a Democratic primary candidate.
Great, thank you. So staying on the national stage, what do you think is going to happen to Congressman Santos?
Well, that's interesting. Well, first we have to get his name right?
Yes,
is he George
yes,
Santos or Anthony DeVolder?
Yes, sir.
There was this, I don't know if anyone heard the fascinating, story this morning. I don't know if it's true or not yet, but you have a veteran who claimed that in 2016, when he was living in a tent and had an ill dog, that Santos, as Anthony DeVolder, basically said he would set up a GoFundMe account for the guy's dog, and he said he never saw the money. There, don't know if it's true or not, but there is a 2016 Facebook post where he says Anthony DeVolder did the scam. In some ways, the Republican leadership wants to keep him in because they have such a small majority. He comes from New York. That seat might be tougher to fill. Unlike Senate seats, it's not, the governor doesn't appoint that, and there's a special election. Let me just say, I think it's going to be hard for him to stay on for another 6 months because the stories are getting worse and worse. And it seems to me that he's going to have legal problems. He certainly had legal trouble in Brazil, and he may have legal problems here. So I think despite the effort to keep him on, this doesn't seem to me to be a story that's a 1 week or a 2 week story, because as people dig, this whole notion of how he's obtained his money, how he has that, is likely to get worse and worse. So I don't think that story's going away, and it's just the most bizarre individual I've ever seen. One thing I would mention, whoever the Democrats pay to do their opposition research should be fired immediately, because this stuff is all over the place.
Yes.
I mean, you have him introducing himself with a different name. And, nobody found this out. It's just inconceivable in a modern election cycle where people are spending hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars, and everybody does opposition research. The Republicans did opposition research on them and found out much of this stuff. It's hard for me to imagine how the Democrats missed it.
Exactly. That is definitely the shocking one. People do opposition research when you're running for dog catcher, more or less, a U.S. congressional seat. So, well, speaking of kind of that national stage and challenges, we have a couple of questions on the January 6th insurrection. What do you see as the long-term effects of the January 6th insurrection on our national and state stage of politics and kind of democracy?
Yeah, well, certainly it's, I think we have, very serious challenges that are emerging because of the same kind of election denialism that prompted January 6th. And it's odd in a way, because if you think about the integrity of elections, from my sense, they're probably far more fairer today than they were 80 years ago or 100 years ago, where you had bosses determining who won or who lost. And you read the stories about, Lyndon Johnson's Senate election, or even the presidential election of 1960 and what happened in Illinois. And I just don't think that kind of happens. In Virginia, for instance, every local electoral board has to have one Democrat, one Republican, and then a third person that comes from the governor's party. So it's hard for me to imagine that these local election boards are corrupt, given that the way they're formed on that front. But it's really problematic when you see some of the violence that's emerging from here. The situation that you're reading about in New Mexico now, I know, where somebody wasn't even close in the election and then hires people to go shoot at election commissioners and the leader in the house, at the house of the election leaders there. And then he got mad that they were shooting too high and shooting too late, that they were shooting over the house of these people and they weren't hitting anybody. So he goes out with them and says, I'm going to show you how to do it. It's stunning. You had the people in Michigan with, going to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer and put her on trial. This has become, I think, unfortunately, very, very problematic. And beyond that, it's generating a lack of faith in elections among at least a certain group of people. And that is becoming highly problematic. I remember a Virginia election not a couple of years ago, when there was a tie.
Yeah.
They had to pick the name out of a bowl. Nobody complained that that somehow this was illegal or wrong, or that it was corrupt. It just turned out to be this oddity. So it's very very problematic, and I actually think that there is a real threat to democracy that exists today, and I never imagined it. I would say I always thought that ultimately things got a little better, but I've given up that kind of view that history is a story of progress.
We do have one follow-up question tied that to our General Assembly. So there have been some stories about Delegate John McGuire's involvement in the January 6th insurrection. And so the question that we have is, do you see any repercussions to him, especially as he's moving forward in this Senate race in an open seat? He's
okay. I didn't get that.
Delegate John McGuire. There have been some stories that he was participating in the January 6th insurrection. So the question we have from one of our audience members is, do you see any repercussions to Delegate McGuire, especially with his run for an open Senate seat?
Yeah, I don't know if January 6th is going to be deciding that seat, given where it's located. It's in one of the most conservative areas of sort of West Central Virginia. I did see some fundraising numbers that said one of his opponents has outraised him considerably, that I saw this morning. So that could potentially have some impact. He's put forward some of the Parents Matter legislation that he put forward this year is almost bizarre in my mind, in the sense that basically the legislation seems to say that parents can opt out of anything they want to opt out of in school. So I'm thinking, like, if you don't like the biology teacher or whatever, you can just opt out because they're not teaching they're teaching evolution or something. That I think has taken it too far. He's been pretty successful overall. What he's had beyond the sort of the political thing, he's really not much. He doesn't come out of the political arena. He's had this very interesting background where he was Navy SEAL, I believe. And then beyond that, he did the SEAL team training in this area, where he's actually trained, and his group has trained thousands of people on physical fitness who are very happy with that, and know him more from that in some ways than they do from the politician side. So I'm not sure inside the district that he's running in, that's going to be a problem. If he was running in Siobhan Donovan's district, it would be a big problem. but I'm not sure how much it's there, other than there's obviously some money behind some of the opponents in that district. I think he had more than one. And so it'll be a primary to watch.
Great, thank you so much. Well, speaking about kind of the larger scale, we do have a question about how do you think that the current fracture in the Republican Party between the MAGA extremists and the more moderate Republicans will play a part in the 2023 general election in Virginia? Do you think Republicans are going to put up more moderate candidates for the state elections based on those 2022 midterm results?
Well, it really depends on what area of the state you're talking about. My guess is that by and large, in the places where Republicans have run very well in the rural areas, there's not going to be much of a change. I would presume that the MAGA point of view, whether it's either for Trump or DeSantis, is still pretty much entrenched, and that's going to exist. The challenge for the Republicans is really in, again, those 3 or 4 or 5 districts that are competitive in both houses. Stafford County is probably Tara Durant running again against Joshua Cole, probably. Where are you going to be on those issues? So my sense is that by and large, in Republican primaries, you certainly have to be a conservative candidate to win almost anywhere. And I don't think the Republicans are going to be very competitive. You used to have moderate Republicans from Fairfax and Prince William. They don't exist. There's not a Republican in the House who represents Fairfax or Prince William. And in Virginia Beach, where election is going to be competitive, some very conservative Republican candidates have won. Tim Anderson, for example, last time. So my sense is that the traditional Chamber of Commerce, business-oriented Republican may still have some traction in Henrico, Chesterfield, a little bit in Hampton Roads, but by and large, that's not where the Republican Party is. That I was telling people the other day after watching what happened in the House, if you're thinking about the presidential race, this is the Republican Party that you're going to be leading. And this is where the base of the Republican Party is in most places, not everyone. One other thing I should mention about the House races that was interesting, is that Republicans may have had the House because they ran pretty well in some Democratic states where abortion, the elimination of abortion really wasn't a threat. Republicans won seats in Oregon and New York, places where they were able to argue about inflation and they were able to argue about, Joe Biden, and able to argue about crime, because no one believes that the legislature in Oregon or New Hampshire is actually going to, make abortion illegal on that front. So the Republicans actually did better than expected, worse than expected in most places, but better than expected in New York and Oregon.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. So keeping in that, both statewide and national focus, we have one of our great VCU faculty asking a question about, the updated data on new voting laws. Will it have an impact on turnout in voting? And as a former VCU faculty member, how would you encourage VCU students to register and vote?
Well, I always think VCU students should register and vote, and they've had an impact actually on local elections, maybe somewhat inadvertently. In 2020 or 2016, particularly when LeVar Stoney, won election. His first election for mayor, about 1,100 VCU students came out to vote against Donald Trump in that precinct. and got the Democratic sample ballot, voted for LeVar, and that gave him the 5th district that allowed him, the district that allowed him to win the mayorship. So again, I believe that, students should be active, energetic, and should go out there and participate. You've had in some parts of the state questions about where local registrars have been reluctant to register college students. Williamsburg around William and Mary has had a big controversy over that. But by and large, I hope that students register at the university, near the university, and are very, very active. I think nationally, certainly some of the more restrictive laws are going to make it more difficult for some people to cast ballots. Some of these election integrity arguments there, when all of a sudden you change having 60 drop boxes to 1 drop box in a county, that's going to change, but that's going to put an even more responsibility on the party and those people who are trying to turn out elections to use whatever they have at their disposal to make sure that people turn out. And that's going to happen. By and large, I think the protections that existed at one time through the Voting Rights Act have been fairly much eviscerated by the courts. So it's really going to be up to the parties and the activists to generate turnout, because they're not going to get much help from the courts any longer.
All right, well, you brought his name up, and we have another faculty member that asked the question. What do you see in Mayor Stoney's prospects as a potential gubernatorial candidate?
That's pretty interesting, because the Democrats don't have a large bench right now, because they don't have an attorney general, they don't have a lieutenant governor. And so the question is, who runs for governor, who runs for lieutenant governor, who runs for attorney general? And because they don't have a large bench, there's probably a number of people, several people considering it, thinking that they're going to do so. As I said, I believe that there's a lot of attention focusing right now on Abigail Spanberger, simply because she has won 2 races in 2 different parts of the state and has won them in districts that were in heavily Democratic districts. I think the mayor is certainly considering a statewide run for governor. I think he looks at this race and says, I may not be all that popular with the most progressive element in the Democratic Party, the most liberal element in Northern Virginia, but that he believes he has a lot of opportunity here. He's a good fundraiser, an excellent fundraiser, connected very closely to the McAuliffe fundraising machine, very well funded by Democratic Party. He believes that in a Democratic primary, 30 to 40% of the voters are African American, and that if he can run well among African Americans, he thinks he has a shot as well. And then he's received some very positive national attention for things that he received less positive attention for here in Richmond in some ways. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post heavily praised his work in removing the monuments here. And he thinks that's quite a message that he can take out to Democrats throughout Virginia. So is he the favorite? I don't think so. Does he believe that he has a lane that's possible? He certainly will. They're not everybody who is, who believes that's going to work out. But we'll have to see. And at the moment, I think what we have to recognize is that there is not a clear sort of front runner for the Democratic nomination for governor right now. And certainly the mayor is one of the people who is seriously considering contesting that race.
Great. Well, we have time for one last question. It brings us to a specific locality here in Virginia that's gotten a lot of attention from both Republicans and Democrats for a variety of reasons, and that's Petersburg. So the question is the Partnership for Petersburg. How do you see that as going? Clearly, we know Governor Youngkin has put a lot of effort and a focus in Petersburg. Senator Morrissey is fighting very hard for a casino in Petersburg. Delegate Coinier has been active. So you've got Republicans and Democrats on all all sides, talking about various issues in Petersburg. So how do you think that the activities going on in Petersburg may impact the General Assembly, or really impact any kind of the individual races or thoughts around that idea?
That's a great question. 2 points here. First, this casino initiative is sort of a battle between Joe Morrissey and LeVar Stoney. LeVar wanting to run a second referendum in Richmond, run it a little differently, basically say some of the money will be used to either reduce property rates or go into schools or something like that. Senator Morrissey wanting to have a Petersburg only referendum on that. And then Senator Morrissey is also going to be involved in a very tough Democratic primary with LaCharisse Aird. And my sense is, prior to a couple of weeks ago, that this was going to be an uphill race for former Delegate Aird. Now that Morrissey has been defeated so soundly, it may not be, that may be possible as well. That's going to be a hotly contested race. And you got all of these sidebars coming in with the Morrissey and his former, soon to be former wife in the news with trading various accusations that are pretty tragic for the kids, I might mention. The Petersburg thing, the most interesting thing in Petersburg is actually, in some ways, not what's happening politically, but it's related to VCU, actually. And that's professor of chemical engineering, Frank Gupton, who has really developed this remarkable way of making generic drugs. And that's being translated into the possibility of putting an advanced pharmaceutical manufacturing cluster in which the science is done at VCU and the manufacturing is done right outside of Petersburg. They have received a $70 million or $50 to $70 million grant from the Federal Economic Development Administration to go forward with this. They've received $500 million from the federal government to build a manufacturing facility there. And they've just put in for a very large NSF grant there. So my sense is that the most interesting thing happening in that area right now is the potential revival of a pharmaceutical industry there. I think Governor Youngkin was smart to do what he did politically. I think what he's done is that he's packaged a lot of initiatives, a number of them that actually emerged during the Northam administration, and put them together. And I'm glad to see that because there's a lot of opportunity there, and it would be, and if you can address some of the big problems that also exist that are related to poverty and education in Petersburg, that would really be a great leap forward for the region and for the people in that area.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Holsworth. As always, amazing insights from the national to the state to the local political front. I think we all have a lot to look forward to and watch some really interesting times between 2023 and 2024 and then 2025 in a gubernatorial. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for attending today. I will turn it back over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you again, Dr. Holsworth. Thank you to Dr. Gooden as well. I see some great comments in the chat. Remember, we are putting our links in the chat for any of the updates that we mentioned earlier in our session. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to the communications team in the background doing the great work. I want to remind everyone that we will have our next session, February 15th, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility, Intersections with Public Administration, with our speaker, Dr. Sesha Joy Moon of the U.S. House of Representatives, Office of Diversity and Inclusion. So please join us at 12 February 15th for our next session. Until then, thank you for spending your lunch with us, and have a great rest of your day.